I believe we are sharing, all of us, main messages that we would like to achieve. For instance, promoting peace, security, and prosperity, and offer freedom, security, and justice within our internal boundaries. I think the interest of the European citizens has similarity to our interest also of the Arab people when looking to those points. So let me tell you that achieving sustainable development and economic growth, price stability, and high comparative market economy with full employment and social progress, protect our and improve the quality of environment, promote scientific and technology progress, is attracting our region. And we see that Europe political, economic, and environmental connect with all the states worldwide, sharing economic crisis that we are suffering from now. And we would like together to find a way out and to see how our partnership can bring common values between us, that we can can find solutions for our future in this region, and together we can do it. This is how I see our relationship as a neighbors to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Erian. We'll certainly build on some of those themes, and it'd be great perhaps later in the panel to hear what the League of Nations does on a day-to-day basis to engage with the EU and its neighbours, but we'll come back to that later, if you will. Secondly, let's stay alphabetically. Dmitry, very nice to have you join us, and it'd be great to hear more about what the UNECE does in this field, and how it sees its role within the European community and the region you represent.
Thank you very much, Adam. Good morning and good afternoon to colleagues from around the world watching us. I'm very pleased to represent the UN Economic Commission for Europe. It's a part of the UN that covers 56 member states, from Canada and the US all the way to Tajikistan. So we have a broader so-called pan-European scope, and the focus of the UNECE is both promoting regional cooperation and integration, and very importantly, creating a regulatory space for 56 countries and in some areas globally in such thematic blocks as environment, transport, energy, housing, forestry, and so on. I won't go into the details of this, but I will say that in our work, and we're one of the 5 regional commissions, the oldest one, and one that had for decades played a role of the bridge between the East and the West, created in 1947. We, of course, in many ways were incubating some of the approaches then later found their most pronounced expression in the European Union structures. So over the years, we have, of course, in this role, been partnering with the European Union in various regards. The EU is a key player. It's shaping the region's future in many senses, and through its neighborhood policies has become a really important stakeholder. If we look east to the neighborhood former Soviet Union, including Central Asia, if we look south, and of course now projecting through many different instruments, including the Global Gateway, its influence both politically but also policy-wise in regions such as Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. We see our relationship with Brussels as that of strategic partners, and we operate at different levels. First of all, of course, all EU member states are member states of UNECE. Secondly, European Union is often coming together as a group in our intergovernmental bodies. Thirdly, on policy issues, let's take transport. Most of the European Union legislation on inland transport, for example, originates, is based on, and is continually updated in sync with the UN regulations. So there we have a duty to work together to make sure that the best available knowledge and expertise in the EU is also fed into the UN processes. We, of course, also benefit from funding and support from the European Union when it comes to technical assistance to countries in the East and in the South. I'll speak about this a bit later when we, I think, can come to the more specific conversations on topics. Finally, of course, we see European Union as a really important player when it comes to progress of countries on the trajectory to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in the region. The region, as any, frankly, region in the world, but European region included, is off track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. On most of the indicators, progress has been slowing, and on many, a significant reversal of a trend is needed. So we see the process of EU accession or approximation to the EU and the process of working on a development agenda, including the SDG achievement, as two processes that go hand in hand. And in that spirit, I think we can also talk today about what is the role of the European Union as a project, as a set of experiences in helping countries achieve their broader development aspirations, lift people out of poverty, overcome inequality, and deal with other sustainable development goals that were formulated at the UN, not by the UN, but at the UN some 9 years ago. I'll stop here, Adam, and I'm happy to come back into the discussion with more detailed points later on.
Thank you very much, Dmitry, and I'm glad you brought in the SDGs there. Obviously, a very important target for the whole globe, and it's quite chastening to hear. But even regions like the European Union are lagging far behind, and we all need to work closer together in making sure we achieve that on a global level. So we'll definitely come back to that. Maybe then carrying on with our next speaker. Very pleased to have Guido Clary join us from the EIB office in Cairo. I think you must be the most well-placed person to speak on the theme we're talking about, being a representative of a European institution based in the MENA region. Over to you, Guido.
Yes. Good morning, Adam. Good morning, everybody. And yes, actually, I'm very glad to represent here the European Investment Bank. And European Investment Bank is the lending arm of the European Union. And we are one of the largest financial institutions in the world and one of the largest providers of climate finance. Actually, we have a strategic role in promoting growth, prosperity, and technological and social progress around the world. And our presence in the region is a testimony of this commitment, particularly for this reason. And we work closely with other EU institutions to foster European integration and to promote the European Union and support European Union policies, actually in over 160 countries in the world. Our way of working is in a way to think globally, but to act locally and to be present in different geography. Just to give an idea of our presence, since our establishment in 1958, we provided more than 1 trillion finance worldwide. And but it's relevant to say that in addition to these volumes, I mean, we provide also and we work with financial experts, engineers, economists in designing, planning, and developing successful investment projects. These and through our support, we try to support countries to develop their economy in a sustainable way, and this will help to address particularly global warming and its impact, which is we can say it's the challenge of our generation. In fact, more than half of our investment contribute to climate action, And on this, we are a proud member of the family of multilateral institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and other regional and national development bank. Here, this office in Cairo is the regional hub for the Middle East and North Africa. We opened this office in this hub in November 2023, and from here, we try to provide support to other countries in the region to improve coordination and synergies in terms of resources that we can deploy. Adam, just allow me to say something regarding, which is also related to something mentioned in the opening session by the Director General Gerd-Jan Koopman, and this is really strictly to our positioning, to our role. I mean, we see in the last years the need to move from this donor beneficiary model on which financial institutions played an important part, and we went to a situation on which the partnership is essential. So to have at the same level countries from European Union and from this side, and we saw in the recent partnership between the European Union and some of the countries that this is becoming real. It is not something just made of principle, but this is becoming the reality. And as European Investment Bank, we are really there to support this transition, to finance specific projects, to promote policies of the European Union, but more importantly, to work in local partnership with local governments. Egypt is a good example, and to sustain priorities defined at local level in terms of sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guido. That's a great overview of what the EIB is doing in the region, and we'll certainly come back to that and some of the as you say, the sort of balance of the relationship, how that's changing, and how the European institutions and Team Europe are navigating that as well. So thank you very much. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome our last speaker to perhaps introduce a bit more about himself and the institution he represents. This is Panayotis Gavras, Head of Policy and Strategy from the BSTD, or the Black Sea Trade and Development Bank. Mr. Gavras.
Thank you very much, Adam, and congratulations to DZ Banken and English's Foundation for this timely and very important conference. It's an honor to be here today and have the opportunity to address you. I do indeed represent the Black Sea Trade and Development Bank. It's a regional, sub-regional, you might say, multilateral development bank. So in terms of constitution, legal framework and all that, it's very similar to an EIB or a World Bank, the same type of supranational entity, but significantly smaller in size and geographical scope. We focus on economic development and regional cooperation in what we call the Greater Black Sea region, which extends from Albania, not exactly a Black Sea country, but close and part of the Greater Black Sea region, as far as the Caucasus in the east, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, again, country which is not on the Black Sea per se. We're based in Thessaloniki, Greece. So again, that gives you an idea of the regional basis of where we are. And we've been in operation for 25 years now, part of the Black Sea Economic Cooperation family, which was formed in the aftermath of the Cold War, when a lot of regional cooperation entities started coming into being in Eastern Europe and in other parts of the world, focusing on the issues of how to promote cooperation and bridging the previous East-West divide, which of course, that was a very different world in the early 90s. We see the East-West divide has very much come up again. Perhaps it's shifted a few 100 kilometers, but it's very much there, and it's making its face in a very pernicious way, as you know, following the invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing war that's taking place there now, which obviously makes the idea of promoting regional cooperation very difficult, not less important, but certainly much more challenging. And that's certainly something I'll be happy to delve into further as we discuss also what one interesting element is that as situations change, you see a lot of adaptation. So, for instance, after years of ties between Ukraine with new EU members, relatively new EU members that joined in 2004, 2007, such as Romania, Bulgaria, and of course, Slovakia, Poland, and all of that, you see a much greater engagement now, born out of necessity in the first instance, of course, but certainly having grown as new export routes, new certainly routes for the many thousand millions of refugees who've come out. They've created ties in a way that never existed before. We used to say that some of these countries turned their back on the East as they looked to the West, as they looked to Brussels. Now we're seeing a shifting of these things brought about again by tragic events, which have created new and different fissures, and we don't know how those are going to play out. But it is a very interesting situation to see as it evolves. And because the EU is central to our discussion today, it's a very prominent player. Some of the countries are members, Bulgaria and Romania being Black Sea littoral states, which are members. There's a number of countries that are accession candidates in the West Balkans. Obviously, Ukraine, Moldova have become now. Georgia's in a more of an in-between status. In some countries, Turkey, big Black Sea power. Obviously, that's been stalled for a number of years. We don't know where that's going to go. And then there's countries who are just not interested in it in the first place and probably not welcome at this juncture. So it's a very mixed bag. We used to have a much simpler thing of EU in, EU out that we used to discuss among ourselves, but it's become considerably more nuanced now and overwhelmed by politics, by geopolitics. I mean, the region is no stranger to crises. The financial crises and the pandemic crises look to be much easier than the geopolitical one that we have right now. And I think that colors a lot of the perspective when they look to the EU as well. This is where I'd like to tie it in that whereas the Sustainable Development Goals are obviously very important and there's a greater degree of awareness and also considerable progress for a number of reasons towards meeting them, although we're not there, as Dmitry correctly pointed, and there are some lagging. I think a much bigger, for many of these countries, especially the smaller countries, a bigger incentive in engaging with the EU is seeking things like stability and security rather than worrying about the Sustainable Development Goals and that sort of thing. And like I said, we can discuss that further as we go into this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gavras. Very interesting points you raise. Of course, Mr. Gutman-Gertjan earlier in his statement talked about the reorientation or the realigning of supply chains due to different geoeconomic and geopolitical things that are always out of our controls most of the time. This is an inevitable thing of life that will keep us on our toes, I'm sure, as well. I think I may want to stay with you for a bit. One of the first questions I wanted to pose to the panel was sort of the current role of the EU in the world and how countries from your region or where you're based perceive the EU and its position in the world. You talked about East and West before. Now we obviously have a very strong identity of East and West, probably more so in the last few years. But is the EU part of the West, or is it seen as a third pillar somewhere? And I thought what you said about some of your member countries not being members, not being interested or not being welcomed. You obviously represent a very wide diversity of nations. Is there a wide diversity of perceptions of the role the EU should play and the role the EU does play in the world?
Absolutely. Look, we have 3 EU members in our institution. Greece, where our institution happens to be based, Bulgaria, Romania, as I mentioned. There's a number of other countries that are interested in accession and are either actual accession candidates or potential accession candidates, and that includes Albania. And of course, when we talk about Albania, there's the whole issue of the Western Balkans and the accession candidates who are there. And they're in a similar pod vis-a-vis not really having begun serious negotiations, and they don't really have a clear perspective of where they're going. There's much more recent countries, such as Moldova and Ukraine, because of the war, who have received this candidate status. And I must confess, I'm not sure exactly what the status is right now, but I do know that they have received, they have made certain steps of progress although it is still very early and there's obviously no definite timeline for when they might join. And Georgia has been deemed a potential candidate, which is obviously a step in progress relative to where they were in the past. But really, most of these countries, in looking to the EU, have seen it first and foremost as a source of stability and security. I think they look at it very much as a Western institution, very much a part of the West. And that actually may be part of the reason for why the Turkish process is stalled. I mean, we see Turkish politics in recent years have been much more ambivalent versus this West versus East sort of thing. Economically, Turkey is very tightly linked and to the European Union. It's benefited greatly from what has happened in with the customs union and all that that's taken place. It's become a huge producer. The pandemic benefited a lot of Turkish companies, as we know, and the nearshoring that's taking place now with the supply chain shifting and all that. Certainly, some countries in North Africa stand to benefit, but Turkey has already been a major beneficiary of this and stands to gain further as it's developed a very large and diversified industrial base in recent years. But politically, it's a little bit more ambivalent than it used to be. For reasons that have to do with domestic politics, perhaps, and because when you live in a region, you do and the fighting's taking place just across the border, perhaps things are seen differently than they are elsewhere. But it seems to be less Western than it was a few years ago. We don't know how that's going to play out. Whereas other countries in the Balkans certainly are much more towards the West. Serbia is a potential exception there, although they do want to become part of the EU, and there's no question of that. And then there's countries like Georgia, which is very Western, Armenia, which is in between, and I think Azerbaijan, which we've seen with its recent application to join BRICS, alongside with Turkey's expressed interest. They seem to be going, leaning in a different direction, or perhaps playing both sides. There's a lot of that going on as well. So it is a mixed bag. It's very fluid. I think that's the other thing that we have to say. I don't think we can't say anything definite and say this is the way it's going to be in a couple of years' time. Obviously, the war is having a big impact too, and how that plays out will certainly have a big impact politically and economically in the future. So it's a tremendous amount of fluidity, and the region is used to uncertainty, and the countries are resilient and adaptable. But some things are very huge. The financial stuff seems easy in retrospect now that you're seeing some of the other stuff that's going on in the region. So, I don't want to put on a prediction hat. We don't know, but certainly there is this fluidity that could play out in any number of ways in the coming years. Although the EU has a big role to play, and I think it's mainly an economic one that I had seen recently. Politically, it's probably exerts less influence than it has in a long time. That needs to be said as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gavras. Of course, no country should be forced, or most countries don't also want to have to make a decision to choose a side. But we'll see what happens with that. Perhaps I'll go back to Dr. Erian on that point. The League, or the Arab League, or the League of Arab States, is actually quite much older than the European Union. It's obviously not a union of countries, it's an association of countries. But how do the members of the League view the role of the EU?
I would say that the 22 countries of the League of Arab States, in their relation with the EU, has went up and down from time to time. I believe when we talk about the crisis that the globe went through, the pandemic and the Ukrainian war, we have something maybe unique in our region we have to consider. The Arab Spring, which came a decade earlier, with its impact on the relationship with the EU, the speed of cooperation and the level of cooperation as well. Now we have 2 people out of 5 in our region affected by conflicts. And we believe that all those, we believe that the Arab Spring, beside the pandemic and the Ukrainian war and the economic crisis all changed the relation, the way that we are looking to each other and how to make a common benefit direction. So now I see that it's time that EU with Arab region are now in better shape for discussion and partnership. We need to find at least joint committed and determined as well the way and the methods that we have to work together to enhance our cooperation and to see the priorities in different sectors that we have to work together for. I believe trade, energy, infrastructure, sustainable transportation, agriculture, food security, digital transformation, water security, small, medium enterprises, and investment relation in general. They are all areas that we see the role that, like Mr. Guido is saying for a moment, how the EIB is looking to the region from the investment point of view. I believe those are the areas that we have to focus and to see how we can build together and make a change. We should come back to the normal relationship between the region. We should find common interests, goals that we have to work together to achieve. And I believe it's time for better partnership. So I would say, like, just started my answering the question with starting with the point that it's up and down, and I hope that we go up and up in the next coming periods, because we have the interests. I think EU has the similar interests, but we would like to keep it in more dialogue and discussion to find how we can build a real partnership. Thank you.
Yes, I agree, Dr. Erian. It's all about keeping that open dialogue between not only nations but also regions as well. Maybe Dmitry, if I could come back to you just briefly on a sort of a similar question. Obviously, I don't expect you to answer on individual countries and their perception of the EU and its role, but you obviously have a very diverse group of countries there. Canada, UK even is going to have a very different view of the EU now compared to its member states, and over then to Central Asia and Tajikistan. But maybe as a UN institution, how valued or how do you perceive the role of the EU in the global architecture?
Thank you, Adam. I was at an interesting discussion last week that talked about the future of multilateralism, and one of the speakers said something very interesting. It's not about the crisis of multilateralism. Multilateralism is only just starting now, for real. What we call a shift to multipolarity, and what many say is really a crisis of global governance, and in the UN and EU talks, the question of European Union and the global South, so-called global South. It's a term that I think is probably not going to be used much going forward. This topic is a key one because, taking a broader global look at it, UN and EU work together around the world to solve some of the world's toughest problems. And yet, the real premise for a real partnership is trust. And so the biggest capital, our event is called Sustainable Global Capital Summit, but the real capital out there, both in financial markets as well as in politics, is trust. So the incoming commission will probably be relooking at this fundamentally. What are some of the foreign policy, investment, and partnership building trajectories that need to take place? To take root, rather, for the EU and Africa, for example, to have a strategic partnership. The sub-region with which I'm working quite a lot in my current job is Central Asia. It's a perfect example of real interest of both sides, not least because of the critical minerals, of which Central Asia has very large deposits, and the recently signed MOUs between EU and Kazakhstan, and I think one with Uzbekistan, point in that direction. So there is a pragmatic economic sense in that partnership, but also because of the geostrategic rebalancing that Mr. Koopman was talking about. For both sides, it's really important to maintain a level of dialogue that had not been seen or had been on the radar for Central Asia or the EU before 2022. However, to get to reality when it comes to, for example, European Union and Central Asian states, being equal partners, with no Central Asian state aspiring to become a member, with the level of assistance, for example, to Central Asia being much smaller than that to neighborhood countries, it would take a lot of trust building at the level of institutions. It would take a lot of translation not in a literal sense, but a translation of the cultural code of some of the fundamental policy choices that the European Union is promoting, compared to the policy code of the post-Soviet countries that are very much pivoting to Asia, to China specifically, in many of their economic and political choices. So it's going to be a maze for the EU to navigate. And such topics as energy supply, so of course the whole discussion around gas supplies, diversifying them, including with countries of Central Asia and Azerbaijan, the whole discussion about critical minerals, the whole discussion about water. Water is a critical resource that is not just about the green transition. It is about powering, life, frankly, in the next decades, including the role that the EU will play in managing some of the conflicts around shared water resources. So these will be among the make it or break it topics. And I'm not even touching the governance, human rights, and other areas, simply because UNEC does not work on these issues. But the way that Brussels and their partners will tackle these will define the level of trust and will ultimately define the standing the European Union has in these countries. And I think there is a very profound realization about this. For example, EU has a very interesting, very multifaceted EU Central Asia strategy, and there is a lot of outreach going on. So we see it also from our perspective as partners of the EU and Central Asian countries as generally a positive development.
No, thank you very much, Dmitry. And you're right, we should be keeping this very much focused on flows of capital and how financial institutions like DZ Bank can play a greater role in that in the region as well. And going on to capital and finance, maybe Guido, bringing back yourself into the conversation, since being based in North Africa and Cairo, what's your feeling of the perception that Team Europe, if I may use that term, where institutions like yourself are part of, are perceived in Egypt and beyond?
Yes, thank you, Adam. I mean, Team Europe is a very it's a crucial way of working for European partners. In fact, if we start from the definition and establishment of a partnership from the European Union with countries on this side of the Mediterranean, then we move to the implementation part. And implementation means that the resources should be allocated in the right way. Well, in the European way of working, we see a number of players. From we are one of these, European Investment Bank, together with EBRD, together with a number of bilateral financial institutions. And the way that we work in a synergetic way, putting complementarity at the service of our partner countries, I think it's very critical. So just allow me to give you an example. For example, we just inaugurated 3 months ago an important investment here in Egypt, the Gulf of Suez wind farm. And this was the result of the cooperation between the European Investment Bank, with the government of Germany, France, and probably most importantly, with the resources of the European Commission. So this way of working, of blending together resources, of building synergies between partners is really crucial. And of course, there are very tangible results in terms of project. Just to go back to this example, through this project, we really accelerated the transition towards clean energy in Egypt. With more than 70 turbines, we have been able, and currently more than 400,000 homes are provided with clean energy. So a very clear example of the way Team Europe can deliver in this country and can deliver according to the strategic direction of the European Union.
Thank you, Guido. Giving some of those case studies of those projects you're involved in brings me on to one of the other questions I want to ask the panel. Is this concept of can Team Europe's investments and relationships with its neighbours truly be mutually beneficial for both sides? There's often been maybe a perception that it's one-sided or a bit extractive, but are we seeing that change now? Guido, sorry, did you hear it?
Okay, it's yes. Look, it's still a question for me. Okay, I thought I think yes. No, I see the relevance in finding the right way of working within the Team Europe playground from the other side, from the partner countries. And again, allow me to give you an example. Egypt set up a platform which is called NWAFI, and it's a very articulated platform which is mandated to orchestrate all the Team Europe and also other FI, including the World Bank and other partners, in financing specific projects. And seeing that our partner in our country are able, in a way, to set up this kind of approach, which ultimately leverage synergies between partners, reduce attrition, which of course can take place when we implement a project and we work together. There could be different way of looking and finding solution. And thirdly, they find the best way to allocate resources in different countries. From my experience, for example, I was working on projects on which I saw different part of the government, different ministries, not in this region, working in a way independently with their own agenda. And I think that if we want really to have a sort of holistic approach and a sort of strategic, sustainable approach, we should find and look at this kind of example where also different part of the government of a country are able to reconcile and to be focused towards the same objectives and to work together with the international partners. Sometimes we speak the same language, but again, we need this kind of approach to work better and to work in a more focused way.
Thank you, Guido. Yeah, as Dr. Erian said, it's all about communication and dialogue, isn't it? Maybe a very similar question back to Dmitry, just because you brought up this, the idea of obviously the raw materials, the pragmatic types of relationships and agreements European countries and the EU has with some of its neighbours. Do you see that these relationships can truly be mutually beneficial for both sides, Dmitry?
Yes, and that will require, first of all, some bigger dose of policy dialogue. What Mr. Mariyasin referred to, the CBAM, is a very significant development for many neighborhood countries. I have been to a number of countries in the Western Balkans and Central Asia and other parts of the region. And I've been hearing that they have been feeling that this is an imposition without consultation. That is a very specific illustration of what a real trusted relationship would entail. So a transition period on CBAM is a good example of where and managing it properly, where I think we could make progress. Another one is understanding how the next generation of funding and financing instruments might respond to the country's strategic interests while preserving the key objectives of the EU, including the digital and green transformation. Most countries that we're talking about in the neighborhood of the European Union have adopted nationally determined contributions for climate. They have set their goals for net zero by most of them 2060, some 2050, but the pace of change is not the same as what is assumed when big investment plans are announced by EU for the region, and this requires a serious conversation on how realistic it is. What many countries would comment to us on, and here, I mean, I hope that this is not, I'm not disclosing any secrets, but on the one hand, some of the conditionalities that come through with financing might look, really advanced and almost prohibitive for countries further east and south, especially when it comes to green. While the European Union then itself, within the EU27, has much more flexibility to pause certain provisions of regulations to restart certain activities. Let's give the example of coal mines when the energy crisis after the war in Ukraine started hit very hard. So EU has a set of instruments, and it has an agile management approach to them within EU27, right? Depending on how the poly crisis is evolving, there is a way for the Council to adjust things. Can there be a similar, more agile mechanism to adjust the neighborhood policy, including the financing tools, when in sync with the poly crisis? And can there be much more dialogue on this that is less about top-down conditionalities conversation and much more about how can we design a realistic policy package together that actually works for you and that enables you, for example, and it's my final point, and for countries in the Caucasus or Central Asia to simultaneously advance their partnerships with China, for the Caucasus with Iran. It's just reality. For a country like Armenia, they only have, few open borders, and partnership with Iran, it's critical for them. So what do you do with the sanctions regime around that? And how do you, for example, ensure that connectivity projects, including the corridors, which the European Union and all of us, we are working very closely with the EU, for example, in the Trans-Caspian, and we're discussing some elements of this with the EIB and EBRD and others. How can we make sure that what we're designing actually doesn't put countries in an impossible position vis-a-vis China or Iran, and we facilitate a dialogue that is realistic? Because what might happen otherwise is that countries tick the boxes but never actually sign the real projects, that they have excellent dialogues in Brussels but don't actually take loans from European institutions at the scale at which they could, and that would have enabled a real transition to take place much faster. So these are some of the conversations, and we as the UN are trying to work with all partners involved to help countries use European instruments better, but also to work with the European Union institutions to adapt their policy packages around those instruments to the requirements and the realities of the countries on the ground.
Thank you, Dmitry. And I think that's a very important point, this concept of conditionality, but I don't think it's only the EU and Team Europe that suffer with that, but obviously many of the Western DFIs and other related agencies have that issue, and China being the obvious counterpoint to that has a different approach in some ways, but yeah, it's a very interesting discussion. I suppose perhaps carrying on that sort of slight DFI Team Europe theme, coming back to Mr. Gavras. within the region you represent, or the members you represent, is there still a need for more projects like global gateway type projects, like the global gateway obviously being a policy objective to create more interconnectedness with its neighbours? Yeah, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that.
Adam, I'm going to pick up on something that Dmitry said about the understanding of, there's a lack of appreciation of the real needs of these countries in the dialogue. The EU is often very focused on what the 27 are thinking and the various horse tradings that go on in Brussels and all of that. And there really is a lack of appreciation many times on where they're coming from and what they need. We actually, in Eastern Europe now, in Caucasus to some extent, we have a renewable investment boom that's slowly gathering pace. More and more countries are moving in and taking it. Are they doing it to meet the Sustainable Development Goals? Yeah, that's nice, sure. They report on that and they say, yeah, we're moving towards that direction. What's really underpinning that? Security. It's more autonomy. It's less reliance on unreliable sources of energy. It's being less linked and exposed to blackmail from what's going on with the geopolitics that underlie that. I think that's a crucial element that needs to be understood and appreciated. Dmitry's point about Armenia and Iran is excellent. Armenia depends on them. You can't just, sanctions policies that are created in Brussels or Washington because they don't like something. These have a very real impact when you're actually right next door to the country and you have the degree of reliance and other problems that a country like Armenia faces. And Armenia is not unique in this. It's just one of the more isolated cases. And I think it was an excellent point that Dmitry raised. The other thing is that the renewable energy boom is being driven by the fast improving economics of the renewable sector, especially PV, photovoltaics. The economics are driving it to a considerable extent, and that's why there's such a great interest in it. So, A, it's cheaper. B, it creates greater self-reliance and less dependence. And yeah, sure, okay, we'll report this always saying the SDGs and the things that we're doing and all that, but it really is taking more of a secondary thing. And many times, you mentioned Global Gateway. I challenge you to go, other than the people in government who deal with the EU on a daily basis, I challenge you to find anyone else who will have any idea what Global Gateway is or any of these other EU things. It's not to bash on the EU. I want to be clear about that because that has a very important role to play. And the countries are fully aware that they need the EU as a partner much more than the EU needs them. If you're a country like Moldova, for example, or Armenia or whatever, you're isolated to a certain extent. Albania, these countries do want to join the European Union for a number of reasons, but the number one thing is the security and stability that they bring, the prosperity, and then the ability to do all these other things that sometimes seem to figure high up on the EU agenda are further down on their agendas for any number of reasons. So I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. And it's been something that in the 25 years that my institution has existed, we've seen on a regular basis. There is this lack of appreciation, and it's almost an inability to understand what's going on. And again, it's not to bash, it's a realistic assessment of what we have seen. And that sometimes where we do see progress, it's more of a coincidental type of a thing. We've seen, for instance, tremendous progress in the Balkans in terms of regional economic cooperation among the countries. That has a lot to do with all the countries that have joined the EU or have become accession candidates, the barriers that have come down. Gradually, we see much greater, peace, stability, a return to normalcy to the point now that the Balkans barely figure in daily news, and that's probably a good thing. But certainly on the economic level, if here where I am in Thessaloniki, in the month of August, you saw more license plates from Bulgaria, Romania, and Serbia than you did from Greece. That's a success story. That's a little anecdotal little piece of thing, but it shows that there's been tremendous progress made, and the EU is fundamentally behind that in many ways. There's no question of that. However, when we talk about these initiatives, I don't think they register very well. There is lip service, again, something that the other speakers mentioned, because they know that it's a priority for the EU, so they'll tick the boxes and they'll do whatever. But there's no real ownership because it's not what they really prioritize. It's not what they really need. And maybe the level of trust is not there too. I mean, since over the last 15 years, we've seen a tremendous decline of trust, I believe, in the international area, especially around Europe. There used to be much more, many more initiatives for regional cooperation. After the financial crisis, they dissipated. The worsening geopolitics obviously didn't help either. But there is a need for it. And where you can't trust and you can't develop things expensively, perhaps you look at the needs that people have and you focus on those. You know, insurance can take many forms for countries, whether it's dealing with migration, financial crises, ecological crises, natural disasters, or whatever. Maybe those are areas to focus on too as a priority, rather than looking at it and saying, you know, this is to meet an SDG. Forest fires are horrible in many cases, and they spill over borders and all of that, and they create all sorts of problems. But if you start putting them in terms of the carbon capture or that you lose and all of that, you lose people here. If you put it in terms of the lives saved, the livestock, the economic damage, how they can work together, pool resources to be more efficient, and there has been a lot of that. You see Romanian and Serbian firefighters in Greece, in Bulgaria and whatnot. And so the countries understand, and to the extent that the EU can facilitate that, I think that's a very good thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gavras. I know we're running very short on time. I think it's a very important point you mean, that maybe the person on the street doesn't know what the global gateway is, but if you mention maybe something like the Belt and Road, it might be something more, even beyond sort of policy people like us, it might be more familiar. I'm not sure, Guido, if you wanted to respond to that, or Dr. Erian, if you had any thoughts on what we just heard, please.
Yes, please. In fact, it's not about what EU is looking for investment for, but it's about what the two regions should consider as important for them. For instance, in our region, for instance, investment is very important, especially de-risking investment is very important. We have an initiative for this. And we are cooperating with EU on that subject. But from the other side, when we talk about stability and migration, this is not only considering our two regions, but also Africa, because the majority of climate change impacts now happening in Africa, people are moving and more to the north, and I believe that needs a kind of cooperation. Different, maybe, in the way we are looking to the subject. We have Hawar, and Hawar is taking place in Brussels about migration, the last meeting. But at the same time, I would say we should go more in depth in areas that is important for the long-term relationship between EU and our region, to make our neighborhood more strong and with long-term strategic partnership. So I encourage very much to have EU with us in our MAN initiative, for instance, in the region, to play a major role. But at the same time, I would like also when EU looks to the regions and our region, for instance, to consider that we are also going to suffer other things that can be extended also to Europe if we are not taking together common measures to stop it, like migration, for instance, due to climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Very, very topical points, of course. So maybe Guido, as we haven't heard from you for the last few minutes, you may want to say a last few words of the role that Team Europe hopes to have in the region, and well, unfortunately, we'll have to wrap up the panel.
Adam, I want to add something to Global Gateway because this is an important approach, and particularly I want to add the consideration. Global Gateway is not just about physical infrastructure, but more than 10% of the funding will be dedicated to digital infrastructure. And this will facilitate transmission, storage, and the development of artificial intelligence. And in addition, this is also a key component of the strategy in the supply of hydrogen, and a very important way for advancing the European Green Deal. So Global Gateway is many things. There are many aspects to consider, and we see this as a very ambitious approach that the European Union is taking forward with the partner countries.
Well, thank you very much, Guido, and that's a very positive sort of message, which is a great way to wrap up the panel. I'd like to thank again our speakers for giving your time and also your thoughts to this conversation. It's obviously an ongoing conversation, and as we said, it will go ups and downs throughout the whole lifetime as well. Thank you too for our audience for listening in, and I hope you enjoyed the conversations, and thank you again to the panel. So from me, Adam, I wish you a good day ahead, and we look forward to the next panel. Thank you very much.